His bank account was always empty. His future felt like a locked door. So he canceled his subscriptions. He packed his lunch. He started walking to work. He invested the $100 every single month, no matter what. He wasn't chasing get-rich-quick schemes. He was building a cathedral. Watch the full story, The $100 Millionaire. The morning Evan Carter decided his future had to change. The sky over Baltimore was the color of stale coffee. Thin gray clouds stretched over brick rooftops, a kind of tired daylight that never quite commits to shining. He sat at the edge of his unmade bed, one sock on, phone in hand, staring at a new text from his bank. The message was polite but merciless. Checking balance $238.41. Minimum payment due tomorrow $117.89. He sighed, rubbed the heel of his palm against his eyes, and let the phone fall to the comforter. The apartment hummed with the noises he'd stopped noticing. The window fan clattering against its frame, a bus signed to a stop 2 streets down, someone arguing through an open window. He lived on the second floor of a narrow brick building that always smelled faintly of cooking oil and rain. His own kitchen was visible from the bed, a single bulb over the sink, dishes drying on a towel. The word Tuesday written on a whiteboard that hadn't been updated since March. At 32, Evan was supposed to be doing all right. He had a job that paid on time, a customer support associate for a software company downtown. The work was endless but predictable. He answered calls, typed apologies, logged tickets, smiled through scripted empathy. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the rent and kept his student loans from defaulting. From the outside, that was success enough. Inside, he carried the quiet dread of a man who could never seem to get ahead. He wasn't reckless. He didn't gamble, didn't splurge on designer shoes or weekend trips. Yet somehow the money leaked away month after month, like a slow drip in a pipe he couldn't find. Every payday began with optimism. This time I'll save something, and ended with disappointment. He had become fluent in postponement. That morning, as the traffic outside built into its usual chorus, he remembered the video that had played on his laptop the night before. A woman with calm eyes and an even calmer voice explained that $100 a month, just 100, could become more than $1 million over 30 years if you invested it instead of spending it. She'd said it the way teachers explain gravity. Unexcited, absolute. Evan had replayed that sentence 3 times, waiting for the catch. Surely there was one. He'd done the math himself later, typing on his phone calculator like a man solving a riddle. 100 times 12 months times 30 years equaled 36,000. How could 36,000 possibly become $1 million? The numbers didn't add up, unless something else was happening in between. She called it compounding interest. He'd called it unbelievable. But disbelief didn't stop curiosity. He remembered sitting there in the glow of the laptop, the city outside gone quiet, feeling a strange tug in his chest, a mix of irritation and hope. The irritation came from realizing how little he knew about something so important. The hope came from the possibility that maybe the secret to wealth wasn't locked behind a salary, but behind consistency. Now, in the half-light of morning, he poured the last of the coffee into a chipped mug, sat at his kitchen table, and opened his notebook. Between grocery lists and random scribbles, he found a blank page. In uneven handwriting he wrote, "What if I start with $100? He looked at the line for a long time. The question felt heavier than the number. His parents would have laughed kindly if they saw him now, pretending to be an investor. His father had worked the night shift at the postal service. His mother cleaned offices part-time. They believed in safe money, cash in envelopes, savings accounts that earned pennies but lost nothing. The stock market, to them, was a fancy casino for people who already had extra to lose. Evan had inherited their caution, but not their stability. The world had changed faster than their advice. He took a slow sip of coffee and looked around the apartment. Nothing in sight was expensive. The couch was secondhand. The TV was small. Yet the rent devoured half his income, the bills another quarter. What remained vanished in little comforts: the streaming services, the takeout meals, the Uber rides when it rained. It wasn't extravagance. It was exhaustion dressed as convenience. He decided, almost impulsively, to see where the leaks were. He gathered receipts, opened his banking app, started scrolling backward through months. Every latte, every subscription renewal, every just this once delivery, lined up like fingerprints of habit. At first he felt defensive, muttering excuses into the air. But as the hours passed, the pattern became undeniable. Tiny choices, multiplied by time, had quietly stolen the future he wanted. He turned off the fan so he could think. The sudden silence made the refrigerator hum sound louder. It felt like the room was waiting for him to do something different. He took a red pen and circled 4 categories: subscriptions, gym membership, coffee runs, takeout Fridays. Together, they added up to roughly $100 a month. The coincidence, or the clarity, made him smile. He could see the trade-off now. $100 not spent was $100 invested. A future meal traded for a lifetime of security. But another voice whispered that this was naive. He'd tried budgeting before. It always started strong and ended with frustration. There was a part of him that hated the word discipline because it sounded like punishment. He closed his notebook, paced the small kitchen, then opened it again. Maybe it didn't have to be punishment. Maybe it was permission to build, not restrict. He opened his laptop and typed, "How to invest $100 a month." The search results poured in like a tidal wave. Index funds, exchange-traded funds, Roth IRAs, dollar cost averaging. Every article seemed to assume you already understood the language. He didn't. But buried in the noise, a sentence caught him. You don't need to time the market. You just need time in the market. He read it again. Slowly, it started to make sense. The idea wasn't to chase luck. It was to stay long enough for patience to do the work. Maybe wealth wasn't built by predicting the future, but by trusting math. That was something he could do. He'd always been good with math, just never with money. He clicked through to a forum where strangers argued about retirement accounts. Someone had posted an image of a tree with roots labeled "Years Invested." Underneath, the caption read, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." The phrase pierced him with equal parts regret and relief. He was 32, not 22. Late, but not too late. The decision came suddenly. His cursor hovered over a button on a brokerage site that said, "Open account." For once, his hesitation didn't win. He clicked. A soundless confirmation screen appeared, asking for bank details, address, employment info. It felt less like bureaucracy and more like ceremony. By the time he typed his signature, his palms were sweating. When the email arrived confirming his new account, he exhaled so hard he laughed at himself. No confetti, no applause, just a quiet line of text. "Welcome, Evan. Your investment journey starts today." He whispered the word journey under his breath. It felt right. That evening, he withdrew $100 in cash from an ATM on the corner. The bills came out stiff and new, warm from the machine. He walked them home in his pocket like something fragile. On his kitchen table, he found an old envelope, wrote "investment seed" across it in black marker, and slid the money inside. He sealed it, pressed his thumb against the flap, and left it beside the notebook. It wasn't efficient. He could have transferred it digitally. But he needed to see it first, to treat the beginning like a ritual, not a routine. That night he called his mother. She answered from her couch, TV humming in the background. "Ma," he said, "you ever invest in the stock market?" She chuckled. "Baby, I invested in you." That was enough risk for one lifetime. He laughed, but then told her about the video, the numbers, the idea of turning 100 into a million through consistency. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a smile in her voice. "Well," she said, "maybe you teach me next." After they hung up, he sat for a while in the quiet. The thought struck him hard. He might be the first in his family to do this, to build wealth on purpose instead of by accident or inheritance. Maybe the real legacy wasn't money yet, but knowledge. He flipped to the last page of his notebook and wrote, "Every million starts with the first 100. Then, underneath, tomorrow, transfer funds. Let run." When he closed the book, something inside him settled. For the first time in years, he didn't feel behind. He felt early. Days turned into weeks, and life looked almost the same. He still caught the same bus, answered the same customer calls, microwaved the same leftovers. But a quiet shift had taken root. On payday, the automatic transfer pulled $100 from his checking account before he could touch it. The first time he saw the deduction, his stomach clenched. The second time, he felt nothing. By the third, he felt pride. It was the feeling of paying himself first, a phrase he'd read in a dusty personal finance book he once abandoned halfway through. Now it made sense. Some nights he checked his account just to see the tiny line of text. Contribution received. The number was small, but the direction was clear. Each deposit felt like a vote for the man he wanted to become. He started walking to work instead of taking the bus when the weather allowed, saving the fare. He brewed coffee at home, turned off 2 of his streaming subscriptions, packed lunch in reused containers. At first it felt like sacrifice, then strategy. A strange satisfaction replaced the old guilt. Every saved dollar had purpose now. He told no one at the office. Investing was the kind of topic that turned into arguments, and Evan didn't want opinions. He wanted peace. But one evening, as he packed his laptop, his coworker Rachel mentioned her latest crypto win. "I doubled my money in 3 months," she said, smiling. "You should get in before it's too late." Evan nodded politely, but the words "too late" echoed. That phrase used to haunt him. Now it amused him. He wasn't racing anyone. His path was slow, deliberate, built for the long haul. While others chased peaks, he was learning patience in the valley. Still, there were moments of doubt. When the market dipped, his balance showed less than he'd contributed. It felt unfair. He was doing everything right, and the numbers punished him. But he remembered what he'd read. Time, not timing. So he let it be. On Sundays, he reviewed his small portfolio the way gardeners check seedlings. Nothing dramatic, just small signs of life, dividends of a few cents, growth measured in decimals. The miracle wasn't the return yet. It was the routine. He noticed other changes too. He was calmer about money in general. Bills still arrived, but panic didn't. The act of investing had rewired his perspective. Money was no longer an enemy demanding attention, but a tool quietly working in the background. That sense of control bled into other parts of his life. He started reading again, walking more, sleeping better. One night, sitting by the window with the city lights flickering below, he opened his notebook to the page where he'd first written the question. The ink had faded slightly. He added a new line beneath it. "It's working." He didn't mean financially, yet. He meant internally. For the first time, he felt capable. He thought of his father, who'd once told him, "Son, the trick is to make sure the money lasts longer than you do." Back then, it sounded like cynicism. Now it sounded like wisdom. He wondered what his father would think if he knew his son owned a piece, however microscopic, of companies that powered the world. He pictured himself decades from now, gray around the edges, explaining compounding to his niece or his future child, showing how small, boring habits can bloom into independence. The image filled him with a warmth that was almost physical. He leaned back, stared at the ceiling, and whispered to the empty room, "Just keep going." The next morning, he did. He woke before the alarm, brewed coffee, opened his banking app, and saw the second automatic transfer had already gone through. Another 100 gone, another 100 planted. He smiled, closed the app, and let the cup warm his hands. The sky outside was still gray, but softer now, more promise than fatigue. He was beginning to understand that wealth wasn't a finish line. It was a rhythm, one deposit at a time, one quiet act of faith repeated until it becomes character. And somewhere between that first hesitant click and this morning's calm routine, Evan Carter became something he'd never thought he could be, an investor. The world didn't notice. No headlines, no applause, just a man with a notebook, a plan, and a belief that even small money, guided well, can change everything. He glanced at the envelope still tucked in a drawer, the one labeled investment seed. The paper had softened around the edges. He decided to keep it there, a relic of the day. He stopped waiting for a miracle and started building one. He didn't know what the market would do next month or next year. He didn't know if his future million would ever show up on a statement. But he knew this. The decision to begin was already paying returns that no chart could measure. Because what he bought with that first $100 wasn't just stock. It was certainty. Certainty that his life could move forward slowly, deliberately, and that he would no longer watch from the sidelines while other people talked about wealth like it was a language he couldn't learn. He learned the first word, begin. And in the quiet hum of his small Baltimore kitchen, as morning light slipped across the counter and caught the rim of his coffee cup, Evan Carter smiled, just a small, private smile, and whispered the promise again, softer this time, like a prayer he intended to keep. 100. Every month. No matter what. Outside, the city stirred. The buses hissed. The vendors shouted. The world kept rushing. But inside that narrow apartment, the future had already started its slow, invisible climb. Compound interest in motion, measured not in dollars yet, but in discipline. The first month came and went quietly. Evan didn't celebrate when the statement arrived, though he stared at it longer than he meant to. The number was small, $103.14, but the sight of it felt like oxygen. He had put money somewhere, and it had grown, even if the growth could barely buy him coffee. He understood now that this was not about size. It was about proof. It was proof that the idea worked. He began to walk to work more often, headphones in, podcast playing. One episode led him to a phrase he'd never heard before, the rule of 72. A financial shortcut, they called it. Take 72 and divide it by your expected annual return, say 8%, and the result is how many years it takes to double your money. 9 years, the host said. 9 years for every dollar to become 2. Evan paused the audio at a crosswalk. 9 years. He whispered the math under his breath, eyes following a pigeon that hopped along the curb. If he invested for 30 years, his first $100 could double 3 times or more. 100 to 200, 200 to 4, 4 to 8. The same pattern stacked across decades, quiet and inevitable. He smiled as the traffic light changed. He'd spent years waiting for big breaks, promotions, bonuses, sudden luck. But here was a different kind of miracle, a small one repeated patiently. When he got home that night, he opened his notebook again. On a clean page, he wrote Rule of 72, and under it, in block letters, time is the engine. He began to see time differently after that, not as an enemy stealing his youth, but as a partner compounding his decisions. The idea electrified him. He wanted to understand the machinery behind it. He spent evenings watching videos about compound interest, not the loud, get-rich-quick ones, but the calm explainers filmed by teachers who loved math more than marketing. They drew curves on whiteboards, lines that started flat and then curved upward like they were learning to fly. Each graph told the same story. Small contributions stay small for years, then suddenly accelerate when growth begins to earn growth. That acceleration, they said, is where patience pays off. The steep part of the curve belongs only to those who waited. Evan thought of his life so far, the jobs he'd quit too early, the habits he'd dropped at the first setback. Maybe his finances had mirrored his restlessness. Maybe wealth required the very thing he'd avoided his whole life, stillness. He bought a used copy of The Simple Path to Wealth from a thrift shop. The pages smelled faintly of basement dust, but the sentences were clean. Index funds are your friends, it said. They grow because the world grows. He underlined that. It wasn't about gambling on one company's fate. It was about owning slivers of the whole economy. He began to imagine his $100 joining millions of others, buying invisible fragments of businesses he'd never see. Airlines, phone networks, factories. The idea thrilled him. For the first time, he felt like a participant in the world instead of spectator. But education, he learned, doesn't erase emotion. The market dipped that spring. News headlines screamed recession fears. Markets plunge. His tiny account lost $6. Objectively trivial, emotionally seismic. It felt like betrayal. He almost canceled his automatic transfer. Why throw good money into a falling graph? He stared at the red numbers on the screen. Heat rising in his chest. Then he remembered a phrase from one of the forums. You only lose if you sell. He took a breath and closed the laptop. The next morning, he let the transfer happen anyway. He went to work, answered calls, drank his coffee, and decided that patience would be his rebellion. Weeks later, the market bounced back, and his balance surpassed where it had been. The victory was small, but the lesson enormous. Emotion was the real enemy, not volatility. He started journaling after each month's deposit, short reflections, part diary, part strategy log. Month 3, tempted to stop, didn't. Month 5, feels slow, but so did learning to drive. He kept the tone steady, like a scientist observing an experiment. The experiment, of course, was himself. He noticed subtle changes in how he spoke about money. He no longer said, I can't afford that. Instead, he asked, is that worth delaying my freedom for? The language rewired his brain. Each decision now had an invisible price tag labeled future value. A dinner out might cost $30 tonight, or hundreds and loss compounding decades from now. He wasn't becoming miserly. He was becoming mindful. At work, conversations about raises or bonuses used to make him anxious. Now they made him curious. Every extra dollar was potential energy. He even started helping a younger coworker set up her own 401k. When she groaned that investing was too confusing, he smiled. It's confusing because no one wants us to understand it, he said. Once you do, it's simple. That night, he called his mother again. She asked how the stock thing was going. He told her about the rule of 72, about doubling money by waiting. She laughed, saying, Honey, at my age, I'd rather double my vacation days. But he could hear pride hiding behind the joke. She asked him to send the link to that calculator he'd mentioned. The conversation left him glowing. Maybe change could ripple backward as well as forward. He marked his first anniversary as an investor on a rainy Friday. 12 automatic deposits, 12 small votes for discipline. His balance stood at $1.273. Not impressive to anyone else, but to him it was sacred. It represented a year of consistency, something he'd never managed before. He celebrated by buying a single slice of cheesecake from the corner bakery. He lit a candle on it, laughed at himself, and blew it out. The ritual wasn't about indulgence. It was about acknowledgement. He spent the rest of the evening reviewing his notebook. So much had shifted in 1 year. Not his income, not his address, but his sense of agency. Money no longer happened to him. It happened because of him. As summer deepened, he began waking early to walk by the harbor before work. The water reflected the city in pieces, buildings, cranes, gulls, each fragment forming a larger whole. It reminded him of his portfolio, many small parts, collectively significant. One morning, sitting on a bench with his coffee, he met an older man feeding pigeons. They started talking about nothing, weather, traffic, until Evan mentioned he was learning to invest. The man smiled, eyes crinkling. Good, he said. Most people wait for permission. Don't. They talked for nearly an hour. The stranger's name was Thomas. Retired electrician, 71. He'd started investing through his company's pension at 28. Didn't know what I was doing, he admitted, tossing crumbs. Just kept showing up with a paycheck. Evan asked what it amounted to after all those years. The old man chuckled. Let's just say my grandkids won't need to worry about tuition. The sentence hit Evan harder than any spreadsheet. There it was, proof in human form. A life transformed by ordinary repetition. Before leaving, Thomas said, the first decade feels like watching paint dry. The next feels like watching fireworks. Don't quit before the colors. Evan carried those words home like scripture. He pinned a note above his desk. Don't quit before the colors. In September, he received a small raise, barely 2%. Old Evan would have shrugged. The new one adjusted his transfer to $120 a month. He wanted to test the compounding power of small increases. He spent evenings experimenting with online calculators, changing variables like a scientist tweaking formulas. Each tweak revealed the same truth. Consistency dwarfed everything else. A one-time windfall couldn't compete with decades of quiet discipline. Around that time, headlines screamed again: war overseas, Inflation climbing, markets dipping. He didn't flinch. He had read enough history to see the rhythm. Fall, recover, repeat. Human optimism, it turned out, was one of the most reliable investments of all. He started to share snippets of what he learned on a small blog he built for fun. Short posts titled, "Patience Pays Dividends, Why Boring Works, The Rule of 72 in Real Life." He didn't advertise them, but strangers began leaving comments. One wrote, "I'm 40 and just starting. Thank you for making it sound possible." Another said, "I showed this to my teenage son." The responses humbled him. He realized that teaching reinforced his own discipline. Every time he explained compounding to someone else, he recommitted to it himself. By winter, his balance had crossed $1,500, a number so small in the world's eyes, yet monumental in his. It represented identity, not wealth, proof that he could build stability from intention. One evening, snow tapping the window, he reread an old journal entry. "What if I start with $100? Under it he added, "What if I never stop?" He looked around his apartment. The same space, yet it felt larger somehow. Maybe because he was no longer boxed in by fear. He made a pot of tea, opened his notebook, and began drafting a new goal: financial independence by 50. The words looked bold on the page, almost arrogant. But he didn't cross them out. He underlined them twice. He spent hours mapping backward. How much he'd need to invest, the expected return, the sacrifices required. The math told him it was possible if he stayed consistent and increased his contributions each time his income rose. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a formula. He smiled, feeling the quiet thrill of alignment. The moment ambition meets arithmetic. The next day, he met Rachel from work for coffee. She complained that her crypto portfolio had crashed. "I lost everything," she said, shaking her head. "I knew it was risky, but still." Evan listened, sympathetic but calm. When she asked what he was investing in, he told her, "Index funds. Boring stuff." She laughed. "That's it." He nodded. "That's it. The trick isn't excitement. It's endurance." She stared at him for a moment, then said, "Maybe I'll try boring." He left the cafe smiling. He hadn't preached. He'd simply modeled. Maybe that was enough. Months passed. His notebook thickened with notes and scribbles. He added a section called Financial Lessons from Everyday Life. Under one entry he wrote, "Coffee takes 4 minutes to brew. Wealth takes 4 decades. Both taste better when you wait." His writing became his mirror, each page capturing the transformation of a man learning not just how to earn, but how to believe. One evening in spring, his mother called again. She'd opened a small investment account through her credit union. "Only $50 a month," she said, half proud, half embarrassed. "That's perfect," Evans said. 50 becomes 100. 100 becomes peace. She laughed. "You sound like one of those finance gurus." He grinned. Just someone who finally read the manual. After they hung up, he realized what that meant. His family tree had quietly sprouted a new branch, one watered by knowledge instead of fear. He returned to the harbor bench the next morning. The same bench, the same view, but he was different. He took out his phone, opened the calculator app, and typed 72 divided by 8 is equal to 9. The rule of 72. 9 years to double. He whispered, 9 years, and imagined the curve of his life bending upward in slow motion. He pictured his future self at 41, checking his account and smiling at the quiet doubling. Then again at 50, the curve steepening, the fireworks beginning. He closed his eyes, letting the harbor wind brush against his face. Somewhere, deep in that invisible machinery of global markets, his dollars were at work, tiny workers building something durable. He thought about how fragile he'd once felt, how permanent that fragility had seemed. Now, for the first time, he felt rooted. Not rich, rooted. As the sun rose higher, he stood, pocketed his hands, and walked toward the day. The city buzzed around him. Horns, chatter, the rush of morning ambition. But inside he carried a slower rhythm, the patient hum of compounding returns. The rhythm of someone who had stopped chasing windfalls and started cultivating time. He didn't know it yet, But that rhythm would change everything: his work, his relationships, even his sense of purpose. It would teach him that financial independence isn't a finish line to sprint toward. It's a landscape you grow into, one patient season at a time. And as he disappeared into the crowd, notebook in his bag, auto transfer quietly scheduled, the narrator's voice lingers over the image of the harbor: still water, slow tide, the invisible doubling already underway. The first statement arrived not with a triumphant fanfare, but as a silent, digital PDF. Evan clicked it open, the glow of his laptop screen alone beacon in his dim apartment. The balance was $103.14. He stared at the number, a small, almost laughable figure in the grand scheme of his debts and dreams. But it wasn't the number itself that held his attention. It was the decimal point. It was the 14 cents. That tiny, fractional addition was not money he had earned through labor. It was money that had been earned by his money. It was a whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible, but it was the whisper of a new language, the language of ownership. This whisper, however, was quickly drowned out by the roaring chorus of his own psychology. The market, in its infinite and indifferent wisdom, decided to test him that spring. A confluence of geopolitical fears and inflation reports sent ripples of panic through the financial news channels. Headlines on his phone screamed in digital alarm: recession fears grip markets. Major indices plunge. He opened his brokerage app, a habit he was trying to curb, and saw it. His balance was no longer $103.14. It was $97.02. He had put in $100 of his hard-earned, carefully saved cash, and the world had taken $3 of it. Logically, he knew it was a paper loss. Emotionally, it felt like a personal failure, a theft of his fledgling discipline. A cold, familiar anxiety tightened in his chest. The voice of his father, a man who believed in the sanctity of cash under the mattress, echoed in his mind. "See, I told you. It's a rigged game for rich men. They'll take the shirt off your back." Evan's finger hovered over the sell button. It would be so easy to pull out his $97, lick his wounds, and return to the predictable scarcity he understood. Why throw good money after bad? This was the conflict, the first true test of his resolve. It was not a test of his financial knowledge, but of his emotional fortitude. The market was a mountain, vast and imposing, and he was staring up at its sheer face, feeling the vertigo of the climb. He closed the app. He stood up from his desk and paced the short length of his living room, the worn carpet familiar under his feet. He remembered a line from a forum post he'd read weeks ago, from a user with the handle patient_growth. The stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. The words had seemed clever at the time. Now, they felt like a lifeline. He was being impatient. He was looking at the mountain and fearing the climb, instead of trusting the path. He went back to his notebook, the same one where this all began. On a fresh page, he wrote a new heading: The Mirror and the Mountain. Underneath, he wrote, "The market is the mountain. It is external, massive, and indifferent. My emotions are the mirror. They reflect the mountain, but they distort it. They make it look like a monster when it's just rockin' time. My job is not to change the mountain. My job is to clean the mirror." The next morning, his automatic transfer was scheduled. The old Evan, the one from 2 months ago, would have canceled it. The new Evan let it happen. He clicked the confirmation email, transferred the $100, and felt a surge of something that wasn't quite confidence, but was firmer than hope. It was commitment. He was paying for his financial education, and the tuition was volatility. He went to work, answered calls, and drank his homemade coffee. He did not check the app that day or the next. It was a small act of rebellion against his own fear. Weeks later, almost as if rewarding his patience, the market stabilized and began its slow, meandering climb back up. His balance recovered, then surpassed its previous high. It ticked up to $105, then $108. The victory was minuscule in monetary terms, but monumental for his spirit. He had faced the mirror, seen his own distorted fear, and had chosen to look away. He had learned that the most important part of investing wasn't picking the right stock. It was managing the one asset no one could see, his own mind. This lesson in emotional regulation began to seep into other parts of his life. At work, when a customer was particularly belligerent, he found himself taking a deep breath before responding, imagining he was cleaning his mirror. The frustration was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He started applying the same principle to his budget. An unexpected car repair no longer sent him into a tailspin of despair. It was just a dip in his personal financial market. He would assess the damage, adjust his other spending categories, and keep going. The mountain was still there, but he was learning to climb. He sought out other climbers. He started listening to podcasts not about get-rich-quick schemes, but about the psychology of money. He learned about loss aversion, the proven tendency for people to feel the pain of a loss more acutely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Understanding that this was a universal human bias, not a personal failing, was liberating. He wasn't weak, he was wired, and wiring could be rerouted with conscious effort. One evening, he met his friend Leo for a drink. Leo was an artist, a man who lived in a world of creative passion and financial chaos. He was complaining about a project falling through, a loss of a few $1,000s that had derailed his entire year. "It's just so unfair, man," Leo sighed, swirling the ice in his glass. "One minute you're up, the next you're wiped out." Evan listened, then shared his own recent experience with a $3 loss. Leo laughed. $3? That's nothing." "It wasn't nothing to me," Evan said calmly. "It was a test. If I can't handle a $3 loss, how will I handle a $3,000 loss? The amount isn't the point. The reaction is." He explained his mirror and the mountain analogy. Leo fell quiet, staring into his drink. "So you're saying my problem isn't the lost money," he said finally. "It's my reaction to it." "Maybe," Evan said. "The mountain is going to have storms. You can't stop the storms. You can just make sure you have the right gear to wait them out." This conversation was a turning point. He realized that his journey was accumulating value in a currency he hadn't anticipated: wisdom. And wisdom, unlike stock prices, only appreciated. He began to document this psychological journey in his notebook with as much detail as he tracked his finances. He created a 2-column system. On the left, he wrote market event, e.g., 5% market dip. On the right, he wrote my emotional response, e.g., anxiety, urge to sell, felt like a failure. Then, in a third column, he wrote rational counterargument, e.g., historical data shows recoveries. This is normal volatility. My time horizon is 30 years. This practice, which he called emotional bookkeeping, became as crucial as his financial budgeting. It was the process of cleaning the mirror. The months rolled on. His balance grew, slowly, like a glacier, imperceptible on a day-to-day basis, but powerful and directional over time. It crossed $1,100. The number now felt substantial. It was no longer a fragile seedling, but a young sapling with roots digging into the soil of the market. He had endured several more small dips, each one less terrifying than the last. The mirror was getting cleaner. He thought often about the long arc of the climb. He wasn't just saving for a down payment or a car. He was building a foundation of resilience. He was investing in a future where a job loss, a medical bill, or a global crisis would not spell disaster. He was buying peace of mind, and the dividends were already paying out in the form of quieter nights and more confident days. One rainy Sunday, he opened a historical chart of the S&P 500. He zoomed out to a 50-year view. The line was a jagged series of peaks and valleys, a chaotic scribble up close. But from a distance, the overall trajectory was unmistakably, overwhelmingly, upward. It was a mountain range, and he was a traveler who had finally learned that the path wasn't about avoiding the valleys, but about trusting that the next peak was always ahead. He was no longer just a man with a brokerage account. He was a climber, and he had just passed the most difficult part of the ascent, the point where he stopped looking down and started believing in the summit. Life in the days and weeks that followed looked almost exactly the same. The same bus ride downtown, the same cubicle, the same scripted empathy for frustrated customers. But beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was taking root. On the morning of his first payday, after opening the account, Evan woke with a knot in his stomach. He opened his banking app, and there it was. A line item he had never seen before. ACH transfer to InvestNow brokerage, $100. The sight of it, this digital abstraction of his promise, sent a jolt through him. It was done. The money was gone from his checking account before he could even think about spending it. The first time, his stomach clenched with a primal sense of loss. The second time, the feeling was weaker, a dull echo. By the third automatic transfer, he felt nothing at all. And by the fourth, he felt a flicker of pride. This was the feeling of paying himself first, a phrase he'd read in a dusty personal finance book he once abandoned halfway through. Now he lived it. The rebellion was not loud. It was silent, systemic, and deeply personal. He started walking to work on sunny days, saving the bus fare. He brewed coffee at home in a French press, finding a strange satisfaction in the ritual that saved him $5 a day. He turned off 2 of his 4 streaming subscriptions. He packed his lunch in reused containers, leftovers from dinners he now cooked himself, another small act of reclamation. At first, these changes felt like sacrifices. They felt like denials. But as the weeks turned into months, the feeling transformed. It was no longer about what he was giving up. It was about what he was building. Every dollar not spent on a transient comfort was a dollar invested in a permanent future. A strange new arithmetic took hold in his mind. A $20 takeout meal wasn't just $20. It was $20 that wouldn't compound for 30 years. It was a future $100, traded for a present moment of convenience. He was no longer just spending money. He was spending time. He was spending freedom. He told no one at the office. Money was a topic that bred either competition or pity, and he wanted neither. He was building something for himself, not for show. But one evening, as he was packing his laptop into his bag, his coworker Rachel leaned over the cubicle wall. "Hey, you got to check this out," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. She showed him her phone screen, a colorful chart tracking a cryptocurrency he'd never heard of. "I put in $500 last month. It's already worth $1,200. Can you believe it? You should get in. It's not too late." Evan nodded, offering a polite smile. "Looks exciting," he said, but the words "too late" echoed in the space between them. That phrase used to trigger a panic in him, a fear of missing out. Now it sounded hollow. He wasn't in a race against Rachel or anyone else. His strategy was the antithesis of excitement. It was the deep, quiet work of endurance. He was planting an oak tree in a world obsessed with chasing fireworks. Still, doubt was a tenacious weed. When the market dipped again, his balance would show less than the sum of his contributions. It felt profoundly unfair. He was doing everything right. He was disciplined. He was consistent. And the numbers on the screen punished him for it. In those moments, the mirror would fog over. The mountain would look impossibly steep. He would feel the old urge to log in and hit the sell button, to reclaim control by surrendering. But he had learned. He remembered the rule of 72. He remembered Thomas, the retired electrician, and his advice about the colors. He remembered his own notes in his emotional bookkeeping journal. So, he would close the app. He would go for a walk. He would brew a cup of tea. He would let the automatic transfer do its work, a silent soldier in his rebellion against his own worst instincts. On Sundays, he began a new ritual. He would review his portfolio not with the anxiety of a gambler checking his bets, but with the quiet attention of a gardener inspecting his plants. He looked for small, encouraging signs. A dividend payment of 42 cents. The slow, steady upward drift of his index fund's net asset value. The miracle was not in the size of the returns, but in their existence. The machine was working. The engine of compounding, though still in its earliest, quietest phase, was turning. The routine itself became the reward. The act of investing had fundamentally rewired his relationship with money. It was no longer a scarce resource to be hoarded or a stressful problem to be managed. It had become a tool, a quiet, powerful, generative tool that worked for him while he slept, while he worked, while he lived his life. This sense of agency, of building something durable, began to bleed into every other part of his existence. He felt calmer. He slept more deeply. He walked with a straighter posture. He was no longer a passive participant in his own financial life. He was the architect. One night, sitting by his window watching the city's constellation of lights, he opened his notebook to the very first page. What if I start with $100? The ink had faded, but the question felt more alive than ever. Beneath it, in fresh, firm handwriting, he added a single line: "It's working." He wasn't referring to the money. Not really. The balance was still small. He was referring to the man in the mirror. The transformation was internal. For the first time in his adult life, he felt capable. He felt like a person who could set a long-term goal and move toward it, step by step, month by month, without giving up. He thought of his father's old, weary advice. The trick is to make sure the money lasts longer than you do. It had always sounded like a counsel of despair. Now, Evan understood it as a statement of strategy. He was ensuring his money would outlast him. He was building something that would endure. He pictured himself decades in the future, his own hair tinged with gray, explaining this simple, powerful concept to a younger person, a niece, a nephew, a child of his own. He imagined showing them a chart, not of explosive growth, but of steady, relentless compounding. He imagined explaining how small, seemingly insignificant choices, made consistently over time, could bloom into a life of freedom and choice. The image filled him not with boastful pride, but with a profound sense of peace. This was a legacy, not just of money, but of knowledge, of mindset. He leaned back in his chair, the hum of the city a distant lullaby. He looked up at the ceiling and whispered a promise to the empty room, a promise that was now a core part of his identity. Just keep going. The next morning, he did. He woke before his alarm, the pale morning light painting his walls in soft shades of blue and gold. He brewed his coffee, and as it steeped, he opened his banking app out of habit. The latest automatic transfer had already been processed. Another $100 was gone from his checking account. Another $100 was now at work in the world. He didn't feel a sense of loss. He felt a sense of momentum. He smiled, closed the app, and picked up his coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into his hands. The sky outside was the same Baltimore gray, but he saw it differently now. It was no longer a ceiling. It was a horizon. He was beginning to understand that true wealth was not a destination you arrived at, but a rhythm you learned to move with. It was the rhythm of consistency, the rhythm of patience, one deposit at a time, one quiet act of faith, repeated until it became as natural as breathing. Somewhere between that first hesitant click of the mouse and this morning's calm, unquestioning routine, Evan Carter had ceased to be a man who was trying to invest. He had become an investor. The world had not noticed. There were no headlines, no certificates, no applause. There was just a man in a modest apartment, with a notebook, a plan, and a deeply held belief that even the smallest amount of capital, when guided by discipline and time, could change the trajectory of a life. He glanced at the top drawer of his desk, where the old envelope labeled investment seed was still tucked away. The paper was softer now, the edges slightly worn. He had never deposited the cash. He had kept it as a totem, a relic of the day he decided to stop waiting for a miracle and start building one with his own two hands. He didn't know what the market would do next week or next year. He didn't know if the $1 million would ever materialize on a statement. But he knew, with a certainty that felt like bedrock, that the decision to begin was already paying dividends that no financial chart could ever measure. Because what he had truly purchased with that first $100 was not a share of a fund. It was a share of his own future. It was the certainty that he was capable of building something meaningful. It was the empowerment that came from solving a problem he once thought was unsolvable. He had learned the most valuable word in the language of wealth, and he whispered it again now, a soft exhale in the quiet morning. Begin. The numbers were no longer abstract. They had weight. When Evan's portfolio crossed $2,000, it felt like a fundamental shift. This was no longer a tentative experiment. It was a structure, however small, that he was building. He had been dutifully sending his then $120 into a single, broad market index fund, following the simple path he'd read about. But now, a new curiosity stirred within him. He understood the engine of compounding. But what about the vehicle itself? What was this index fund he owned, and what did it truly mean to hold it? He felt a familiar itch, the same one that had driven him to dissect his spending leaks. He wanted to see the blueprint. One Saturday, he dedicated his research session not to psychology or rules of thumb, but to the dry, mechanical architecture of his investments. He learned that his fund, the total stock market index, was not a single entity, but a container holding tiny pieces of thousands of companies. He wasn't just betting on the market. He was a part owner, in microscopic proportion, of software giants and grocery stores, energy companies and banks. He owned a sliver of the company that made his laptop and a fragment of the corporation that delivered his packages. The entire American economy, in all its chaotic, vibrant complexity, was now something he had a tangible, financial stake in. The thought was dizzying. It made him feel connected to the world in a way he never had before. He wasn't just a consumer, a worker, a taxpayer. He was an owner. This realization brought a new layer of calm. Before, a dip in the market felt like a personal judgment. Now, he understood it as a fluctuation in the collective value of human enterprise. A bad earnings report for one company was a ripple in his vast, diversified pond. A geopolitical crisis might churn the waters, but it was unlikely to drain the pond entirely. This was the core principle of diversification, and he finally felt its power intuitively. He wasn't climbing one mountain. He was traversing an entire range. If one peak crumbled, the others held him aloft. He decided to make his portfolio tangible. He printed out the top 10 holdings of his fund, household names he saw on advertisements and products he used every day. He taped the list to the wall next to his desk. It wasn't for show. It was a reminder. A reminder that his financial future was not tied to a lottery ticket or a cryptic line on a screen, but to the productive output of the real world. When he brushed his teeth, he was using a product from a company he partly owned. When he logged into his computer, he was using an operating system from another. His small, monthly contributions were weaving him into the very fabric of the economy. He was building his own piece of the world. This sense of ownership sparked a more profound behavioral change. He started paying closer attention to business news, not with the panic of a speculator, but with the calm interest of a shareholder. He read about technological innovations and consumer trends, not as an outsider, but as someone whose future was subtly linked to their success. His mindset shifted from, "What is the market doing to me?" to "What is the world building that I am a part of?" This reframe was empowering. It replaced anxiety with a quiet, intellectual curiosity. The architecture of his portfolio also clarified the sheer power of his chosen tool, the index fund. He learned about the corrosive effect of high fees on long-term compounding, the so-called tyranny of compounding costs. He compared the minuscule fee of his index fund to the expensive, actively managed funds that promised to beat the market. The math was brutal and unequivocal. Over decades, those extra percentage points in fees would devour a staggering portion of his potential wealth. He felt a surge of vindication. His boring strategy wasn't just simple, it was intellectually and mathematically superior. He wasn't missing out on a secret world of sophisticated investing. He was avoiding a trap. He was keeping the power of compounding for himself, not giving it away to middlemen. This knowledge solidified his resolve. When Rachel from work cornered him at the coffee machine, her voice hushed with excitement about a new, can't-miss alternative investment, he listened politely. This time, however, he didn't just nod. He felt a newfound confidence in his own plan. "That sounds really interesting," he said, "but I found my strategy. I'm just going to keep buying the whole market and letting it grow." Rachel looked at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. The whole market. But that's so slow. It is slow, Evan agreed, a small smile playing on his lips. I'm building a cathedral, not lighting a sparkler. The metaphor came to him unbidden, and he knew it was the perfect articulation of his journey. Sparklers were bright, exciting, and burned out in seconds. A cathedral took generations to build, stone by patient stone. He was a mason, laying his small, regular stones, trusting in the blueprint and the relentless passage of time. He began to see his entire financial life through this architectural lens. His emergency fund was the foundation, providing stability and preventing him from having to sell his investments during a downturn. His monthly contributions were the load-bearing walls, going up brick by brick. His increasing knowledge was the blueprint, ensuring the structure was sound, and time was the silent, essential partner, allowing the mortar to set and the structure to gain immense strength. One evening, he opened a compound interest calculator, not to dream, but to engineer. He plugged in his current portfolio value, his monthly contribution, and a conservative estimated return. He set the timer for 30 years. The final number was still abstract, a fantasy of digits. But he didn't focus on the end point. He focused on the curve. He watched the line, how it was almost flat for the first decade, then began to curve gently upward, and then, in the final third of the timeline, it shot up almost vertically. The hockey stick curve of compounding. He wasn't waiting for the vertical part. He was investing in the flat part. He was laying the stones for the foundation that would make that explosive growth possible. The patience required was no longer a burden. It was a strategic necessity. He was playing a long game, and for the first time, he understood the rules deeply enough to know he could win. This architectural perspective even changed how he viewed his job. The paychecks were no longer just for survival. They were the quarry from which he mined his building materials. Every dollar saved from his budget was another brick he could add to his structure. This didn't make work feel mercenary. It made it feel purposeful. He was no longer just working to pay bills. He was working to build his future, his freedom, his cathedral. The tedious customer service calls, the long bus rides, the modest lifestyle, they all gained a new, dignified meaning. They were the means of production for his own personal empire of one. He looked around his small apartment. It was the same space, with its second-hand furniture and view of brick walls. But it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a workshop. It was the place where he was quietly, diligently, assembling his future. The envelope in the drawer, the notebook on the desk, the automatic transfer, these were his tools. And with them, he was building something that would long outlast the apartment, the job, and even the city outside his window. He was building a legacy of financial understanding and independence. He was not just saving money. He was constructing a new life. And he was finally beginning to see the blueprint take shape in his mind's eye, clear, strong, and built to endure the storms of time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a thick, creamy envelope that felt alien amidst the usual bills and flyers. It was from his alma mater, a prestigious university he had attended on a patchwork of scholarships and loans that had taken him nearly a decade to pay off. The letter was an invitation to a class reunion, complete with a glossy brochure filled with smiling, successful faces. There were doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs who had sold their startups, and consultants who globetrotted for Fortune 500 companies. As he flipped through the pages, a familiar, cold weight settled in his stomach. It was the feeling of being left behind. This was the first true crossroads of his new financial life. It wasn't a market crash or a budgeting slip-up. It was a psychological test, a confrontation with the ghost of his potential self. The Evan Carter in those photos, the one who had graduated with honors and boundless optimism, would have been disappointed by the man he saw in the mirror now, a customer service representative in a modest apartment, his greatest ambition a spreadsheet tracking a few $1,000s. For days, the invitation sat on his kitchen counter, a silent accuser. The old narratives, the ones he thought he had buried, came rushing back. You should be further along. You're wasting your degree. Your peers are building empires. and you're counting pennies. The disciplined, patient investor he had been cultivating felt small and insignificant in the face of this curated display of conventional success. The mountain of his own making suddenly seemed like a molehill compared to the skyscrapers his classmates had ascended. He found himself slipping into old habits. He almost bought an expensive jacket online, a symbolic armor to wear to the event. He considered taking out a small loan to lease a nicer car for the weekend, just to project the image of having made it. The temptation to use debt to finance a facade was a siren song he hadn't heard in months. This was the conflict, not of money, but of identity. Who was he, if not the high achiever everyone expected him to become? It was during one of these spirals that he opened his investment account. He wasn't checking the balance out of habit or strategy. He was looking for validation, for a number that could somehow measure up to the accomplishments in that brochure. The number, of course, did not. It was a humble sum, a testament to patience, not power. He felt a surge of despair. And then, his eyes fell on the transaction history. It was a simple list, a chronological record of every automatic transfer he had made over the past year and a half. $100, $100, $120, $120. On and on, a perfect, unbroken chain of discipline. He stared at that list, and something shifted inside him. This was not a story of lack. This was a story of creation. While his classmates were climbing corporate ladders and chasing windfalls, he was engaged in a different kind of work. He was building something from nothing, with nothing but his own consistency. He wasn't competing in their race. He was running his own marathon, on a track they couldn't even see. He picked up the reunion brochure again. This time, he looked past the smiles and the job titles. He wondered about their net worth, not in a jealous way, but in a curious one. How many of them were living paycheck to paycheck despite their high salaries? How many were drowning in debt from luxury cars and mortgages on houses that were too big? How many of their impressive careers could vanish with a single corporate restructuring? His $1,000 portfolio, by contrast, was his. It was secure. It was growing independently of any boss, any company, any economic trend that could render his specific skills obsolete. A profound sense of calm washed over him. He realized his portfolio was more than an investment. It was a statement of values. It valued freedom over status, security over spectacle, the long term over the quick win. He didn't need to go to the reunion to prove anything to anyone. The proof was in the transaction history. The proof was in the quiet certainty he felt when he paid his bills. The proof was in the sleep he enjoyed at night, unhaunted by financial anxiety. He made his decision. He would not go to the reunion, and he would not feel guilty about it. This was his insight, the resolution to the conflict. His worth was not determined by his proximity to other people's achievements. It was determined by the integrity of his own plan and the peace he was building for himself. He was not behind. He was on a different path, one that was quieter, slower, but ultimately more durable and truly his own. He took the glossy brochure and dropped it into the recycling bin. The act felt symbolic, a final release from the weight of external expectations. He then opened his notebook and wrote a new entry. The first crossroads. Chose my path over theirs. No debt for display. No envy. Just a plan. The following weekend, instead of networking at a hotel ballroom, he spent a Saturday morning at the public library. He found a quiet corral and read a book on financial history, about the great investors who valued temperament over intelligence. He felt a deep alignment, a sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He was investing in himself, in the most fundamental way possible. This experience solidified a new layer of his financial philosophy. Financial independence wasn't just about money. It was about the independence to define success on your own terms. It was the freedom to say no to things that didn't serve you, even if everyone else said yes. It was the confidence to live an invisible, unglamorous life today in exchange for tangible freedom tomorrow. He had faced the pressure to conform, to compete, to consume for show, and he had chosen instead to build. He thought about the future reunions, the 20th, the 30th. He wondered what the conversations would be like then. While others might be talking about their impending retirement with anxiety, he would be quietly confident. While they might be counting the years until they could escape jobs they disliked, he would be financially secure, perhaps already free. The slow, steady path would have its day of vindication, not in a public forum, but in the private, profound peace of a life lived on one's own terms. That evening, he cooked himself a simple meal, a ritual that now felt rich with purpose. As he ate, he felt not a sense of missing out, but a sense of profound arrival. He had passed the test. He had chosen the cathedral over the sparkler, the marathon over the sprint, the quiet power of his own plan over the noisy approval of the world. He was no longer just building a portfolio. He was building a life, and for the first time, he understood that the two were inseparable. The crossroads was behind him, and his path, clear and certain, stretched out ahead. The universe, in its strange and unpredictable way, decided to test Evan once more. It wasn't a market crash or a moment of doubt this time. It was a windfall. His great Aunt Florence, a woman he'd met only a handful of times, passed away and left him a bequest of $5,000. The check arrived in another one of those formal envelopes, the bank draft feeling heavy and consequential in his hands. $5,000. It was more than double his entire portfolio. It was a sum that, just 2 years ago, would have felt like a life-changing rescue, immediately swallowed by debt or necessary repairs. Now, it felt like a responsibility, an exam for which he had been silently studying. The old Evan, the one who lived in a state of financial scarcity, would have had the money spent in his mind within minutes. A new laptop, a high-end television, a lavish vacation he could post about online. The ghost of that man whispered alluringly in his ear, "You deserve this. It's found money. Live a little." For a full 24 hours, he let the fantasy play out. He browsed travel websites and looked at specs for new electronics. The temptation was a physical pull, a deep-seated urge toward immediate gratification. But the new Evan, the investor, the builder, saw a different picture. He opened his compound interest calculator, a tool that had become as familiar as his toothbrush. He typed in $5,000 as a one-time contribution. He left his monthly contribution at $120. He set the expected return at 8%. Then he projected it out 30 years. The number that appeared on the screen was not just large, it was transformative. That single, one-time infusion, left to compound alongside his regular contributions, could potentially shave years off his journey to financial independence. It wasn't just $5,000. It was a massive, foundational stone being lowered into place in his cathedral, accelerating the entire construction timeline. It was future freedom, crystallized in the present. This was the conflict, a battle between the immediate self and the future self. The immediate self wanted a dopamine hit, a tangible reward for years of struggle. The future self, a man he was only beginning to know and deeply respected, wanted security, options, and peace. He decided to split the difference, not in the money, but in the process. He would honor both sides of his nature. He allowed himself a small, symbolic celebration. He took $100 from the windfall, a mere 2%, and went out for a truly magnificent dinner at a restaurant he could never normally afford. He savored every bite, the ambience, the service. It felt special, precisely because it was a rare exception, not a new rule. It was a nod to the man he had been, a thank you for his endurance. The remaining $4,900 he transferred into his brokerage account in a single, decisive click. It was the largest financial transaction of his life. There was no fanfare, no dramatic music, just the quiet whir of the digital machinery moving his future into place. He felt a surge not of excitement, but of profound power. He had looked a significant temptation directly in the face and had chosen the long game. He had exercised a muscle of discipline he didn't even know he possessed a few years ago. The wisdom he gained from this experience was more valuable than the money itself. He learned that the true test of a financial plan isn't how you handle scarcity, but how you handle surplus. Anyone can be disciplined when they have nothing. The measure of character is what you do when you have something. He had proven to himself that his investor's mindset was not a temporary costume he wore. It was his new skin. This event also deepened his understanding of lifestyle inflation, the silent wealth killer. He saw how easy it would have been to use the windfall as a reason to upgrade his life permanently. A more expensive apartment, a car payment, subscriptions to every streaming service. That one-time gift would have become a recurring annual expense, locking him into a higher cost of living and nullifying its benefit. By investing almost all of it, he had avoided that trap entirely. His monthly expenses remained blissfully, powerfully low. He shared the news with no one, not even his mother. This wasn't a secret born of shame, but of sacredness. This journey was between him and his future. He didn't need the external validation or the well-meaning, but misguided opinions. The windfall was a private lesson, a personal milestone in his development. In the weeks that followed, he watched his portfolio balance with a new kind of detachment. The number was significantly larger, but his emotional response was the same. It was just a data point on a long-term chart. The market dipped the following month, and his account lost a few $100s of its new value. The old Evan would have been sick with anxiety, regretting his decision to invest the windfall. The new Evan felt nothing. It was just the mountain doing what mountains do. The storm would pass. His foundation was solid. This emotional equanimity was the real windfall. The $5,000 had bought him a masterclass in temperament. He had faced a classic financial dilemma and had emerged not just wealthier, but wiser. He had confirmed his own commitment. The portfolio was no longer just a collection of assets. It was a reflection of his evolving character, patient, disciplined, and resilient. He made a note in his journal. The windfall test. Passed. Temptation acknowledged, then outmaneuvered. Celebrated with 2%. Invested 98%. The immediate self is satisfied. The future self is grateful. True wealth is the ability to make this choice without internal conflict. He realized that these small, private victories were the real milestones on the road to financial freedom. There were no plaques or trophies for resisting lifestyle inflation or for wisely investing a windfall. The reward was entirely internal. The quiet, unshakable confidence that he was the master of his money and not the other way around. The $5,000 was a gift, but the wisdom it forged was the true inheritance. The silence of his journey was beginning to feel loud. For over 2 years, Evan had been building in solitude, his only confidant a notebook, a spreadsheet, and the anonymous voices on financial forums. The windfall had proven his internal fortitude, but it had also highlighted a new hunger. He craved conversation, not the speculative buzz of his coworker Rachel, but the deep, grounded dialogue of someone who understood the language of patience, who saw the same mountain on the horizon. He found it, unexpectedly, in the quietest corner of the internet. It was a forum, but unlike the chaotic, opinion-driven boards he'd frequented before. This one was called The Long Path, and its aesthetic was deliberately austere. A simple blue and white layout. No advertisements, no signature lines flaunting net worth. The tagline was a single sentence. We talk about staying the course. It was a community not for stock pickers, but for pathwalkers. He created an account with the handle Cathedral Builder, a private nod to his personal metaphor. His first post was tentative, a simple introduction in the new members thread. Hello, I'm 34. I started 3 years ago with $100 a month. I'm here to learn how to keep going. The responses that trickled in were not flashy or boastful. They were warm, welcoming, and deeply practical. Welcome to the path. The first 3 years are the hardest. You've already done the difficult part. What's your favorite book on investor psychology? It was a language of shared struggle and quiet encouragement. He began reading the journals of other members. There was Patient Oak, a 45-year-old teacher who posted monthly updates about her slow climb out of debt and into investing, celebrating every paid-off credit card with the same enthusiasm as a market rally. There was Riverstone, a 60-year-old man who was 5 years into retirement, sharing reflections on how his decades of boring index fund investing were now funding his travels and his grandchildren's education. These weren't gurus, they were companions. Their stories were not about spectacular wins, but about resilience, consistency, and the profound beauty of a plan executed over time. This community became his external compass. When the market grew turbulent and his own mirror of emotion began to fog, he would log on and read. He'd read about Patient Oak facing a similar dip and writing, "The storm doesn't change the destination. It just makes the path muddy for a while." He'd see Riverstone post a historical chart from a past crisis with the caption, "This too shall pass." It always has. Their collective calm was a contagion of sanity, a powerful antidote to the fear-mongering of the financial news cycle. He started his own journal on the forum, a digital version of his notebook. He wrote about the windfall and his decision. The comments he received were the most validating of his life. "This is one of the most important lessons an investor can learn," wrote Riverstone. "You've graduated." Patient Oak simply posted a single word: respect. This was the insight. He was not alone. The feeling of being an oddity, a boring outsider in a world chasing excitement, melted away. He was part of a silent, scattered tribe of millions who understood that wealth was not an event, but a process. A process built on a foundation of shared values. Living below your means, ignoring noise, trusting in math, and prioritizing inner peace over outer appearance. His engagement with the community deepened his own understanding. He began to articulate his thoughts more clearly in his posts, which forced him to clarify them for himself. He explained his mirror in the mountain analogy to a new member who was panicking, and the act of explaining solidified the concept in his own mind. Teaching, he discovered, was the highest form of learning. He also learned from the community's collective wisdom. He picked up practical tips on tax-efficient investing, learned about different asset allocation models for different life stages, and was introduced to the concept of sequence of returns risk in retirement. This wasn't dry theory anymore. It was advice from people who had lived it or were living it now. It was wisdom earned through experience, freely given. This sense of belonging had a paradoxical effect. It made him more confident in his solitude. Knowing the community was there, a digital campfire burning steadily in the wilderness, allowed him to worry less. He didn't need to check his portfolio as often because he trusted the path, a path that was now well-trodden by those he respected. The frantic need for validation was replaced by a quiet assurance. He even found a local member, Baltimore Bogle, who messaged him after recognizing his city from a post. They agreed to meet for coffee, a real-world extension of their digital friendship. Evan was nervous, half expecting a financial zealot. Instead, he met a soft-spoken librarian named Ben, a man in his 50s with a gentle demeanor and a sharp, thoughtful mind. They talked for 2 hours, not just about funds and fees, but about the philosophy of enough, the freedom that comes from simplicity, and the joy of watching a garden grow over decades. "It's not about getting rich, Evan," Ben said, stirring his coffee. "It's about becoming free. The money is just the tool that unlocks the door. The real work is happening in here." He tapped his own temple. "You're doing the real work." Driving home, Evan felt a sense of completion. His financial life, once a source of isolated anxiety, now had 3 pillars: his personal discipline, his written plan, and his community of support. He was no longer a lone climber on a vast mountain. He was part of an expedition, each member climbing their own face, but connected by ropes of shared knowledge and encouragement. He logged onto the long path that evening and wrote a new journal entry. "Today, I met the path in person. It has a kind face and drinks its coffee black. The silence is now a comfortable one. I'm not walking alone." The first comment came from Patient Oak. "None of us are. Welcome to the tribe." The community didn't make the journey easier. No one could do the work for him. But it made the journey possible in a new way. It normalized the slow pace. It celebrated the unsexy milestones. It provided shelter during the storms. Evan Carter, the cathedral builder, had found his guild. And with his newfound brothers and sisters in commitment standing with him, the path ahead seemed not just clear, but warmly inviting. The portfolio was no longer just numbers on a screen. It had begun to warp the very geometry of Evan's life. It created a new center of gravity, a quiet, dense mass of future possibility that subtly influenced every decision he made. This wasn't a restrictive force, like a budget he had to obey. It was a generative one, a magnetic north that pulled his life into a more coherent and purposeful alignment. He saw it first in his career. A position opened up for a team lead in his department. The old Evan, desperate for validation and a higher salary, would have jumped at it, polishing his resume and rehearsing answers about his passion for leadership. The new Evan paused. He looked at the job description. Longer hours, more meetings, the constant pressure of managing other people's frustrations. He then looked at his portfolio, at the steady, automated growth. He did the math. The salary increase, after taxes, would be significant, but he calculated the hourly rate, factoring in the additional 10 to 15 hours of work and stress per week. The premium was less impressive. More importantly, he asked himself a question he'd never considered before. Is this trade-off worth it? The freedom he was building with his investments was giving him the freedom to be more selective with his labor. He realized he wasn't just building a financial portfolio. He was curating a life portfolio. Did he want to trade his peace of mind, his evening walks, his quiet reading time, for a title and a marginally faster climb up a ladder he wasn't sure he wanted to be on? The answer, to his own surprise, was a calm and definitive no. He did not apply. He watched an ambitious coworker get the position and, within months, become visibly more stressed and weary. Evan felt not jealousy, but a profound sense of having dodged a bullet. His investments had given him the power to say no, thank you, to a version of success that didn't suit him. This new geometry extended to his possessions. A wave of minimalism, not born of poverty, but of purpose, swept through his apartment. He began to see physical objects not just for their utility or aesthetic, but for their ongoing cost. Not their purchase price, but their life cycle cost. A new car came with insurance premiums, parking fees, and the anxiety of potential repairs. A larger apartment came with higher rent, more furniture to buy, more space to heat and cool. Each new possession was a hole in his financial bucket, a constant, slow leak that impeded the compounding magic happening in his portfolio. He started a great purge. He sold old electronics he never used. He donated bags of clothes that no longer reflected his simplified lifestyle. He canceled subscriptions to services that provided more guilt than value. With every item he let go, he felt a corresponding lightening of his spirit. He wasn't just decluttering his apartment. He was decluttering his future. The money from sold items went directly into his brokerage account, each deposit a small victory. The empty space in his apartment felt like room to breathe, room for his future to expand into. His relationship with time itself transformed. He stopped seeing it as an enemy that brought bills and deadlines. He now saw it as his most powerful ally. Every month that passed was another brick laid in his cathedral, another cycle of compounding. He became patient in a way that felt almost supernatural. Long lines, traffic jams, bureaucratic delays. These things no longer sparked frustration because he had made peace with slowness. He was playing a game measured in decades. What was an extra 10 minutes at the post office? This patience bled into his personal relationships. He became a better listener, less rushed, more present. The frantic energy of his earlier life had been replaced by a deep, steady calm. He even noticed a change in his physical health. The low-grade, constant anxiety about money had been a toxin in his system. Now that it was gone, he slept more deeply. He had more energy to cook healthy meals instead of relying on takeout. He walked everywhere, not just to save money, but because he enjoyed the rhythm and the time to think. His financial health was fostering his physical health. The different parts of his life were no longer separate, struggling domains. They were becoming an integrated, mutually supportive system. The most profound geometric shift was in his vision of the future. Before, the future was a vague, frightening place, a landscape of potential job loss, medical emergencies, and an impoverished old age. Now he had a map. He could chart his course. He knew, with growing certainty, that if he continued on his current path, he would reach a point, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, where his portfolio's growth from compounding would surpass his annual contributions. This was the crossover point he'd read about, the moment when his money would be working harder for him than he was working for it. That wasn't just a financial milestone. It was a philosophical one. It represented the transition from being a laborer to being a steward. He began to dream not of retirement in the traditional sense, a complete cessation of work, but of financial independence, a state where he had the freedom to work on what he loved, regardless of the pay. He imagined volunteering at the library where Ben worked. He thought about teaching basic financial literacy to teenagers in his community, giving them the head start he never had. He dreamed of having the time to write, to really write, not for a blog, but for himself. His portfolio was becoming the foundation for a life of meaning and contribution, a life designed by choice, not by necessity. He spent a weekend creating a new document on his computer. He didn't call it a retirement plan. He called it a life design blueprint. It was less about numbers and more about values. What did a good day look like? What kind of impact did he want to have? How much was enough? The spreadsheet had given him the how. This blueprint was defining the why. The geometry was complete. His financial actions were building his financial foundation, which was enabling his life design, which was rooted in his core values. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing circle. One evening, he stood at his window, looking out at the city. The lights twinkled, each one representing a life, a story, a struggle. He no longer felt small or insignificant among them. He felt anchored. He had discovered the secret geometry that connects daily discipline to decades of freedom, that links a modest apartment to a world of possibility, that turns a simple $100 decision into the architectural plan for a life of purpose. His life was no longer a series of random points. He had drawn the lines connecting them, and the shape that emerged was strong, beautiful, and entirely his own. The test, when it came, was not a minor dip or a personal temptation. It was a Category 5 hurricane in the global financial markets. It began not with a single event, but with a cascade of them. A major bank on the other side of the world collapsed under the weight of bad bets. A key supply chain, fragile from years of disruption, snapped. Inflation, which had been a nagging whisper, became a roaring shout. The news channels abandoned all other stories. The scrolling tickers at the bottom of the screen were a relentless river of red. The word crash was used not as a metaphor, but as a present-tense reality. Evan's portfolio, which had been growing so steadily, was eviscerated. It wasn't a 5% or 10% decline. It was a 35% plunge in a matter of weeks. The numbers on his screen were horrifying. The massive windfall from his aunt was now a massive loss on paper. Years of meticulous contributions, of foregone coffees and packed lunches, seemed to have vanished into the digital ether. This was a storm he had read about in history books. It was no longer academic. The mirror of his emotions shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The calm, patient investor was gone, replaced by a primal, terrified animal. His heart hammered against his ribs. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He felt a visceral urge to vomit. This was the real conflict, the ultimate test of everything he had learned. All the philosophy, the rules of thumb, the community support, it all felt like theoretical nonsense in the face of this terrifying, tangible loss. The mountain wasn't just steep, it was collapsing, and he was buried in the avalanche. He did the worst possible thing. He refreshed his brokerage app. Again and again. Each refresh showed a new, sickening low. The digital clockwork of his automatic transfer was still in place, scheduled to pull another $120 from his account in 2 days. The thought of it now seemed insane. It was like throwing $100 bills into a furnace. His finger trembled over the cancel automatic investment button. It would be so easy to stop the bleeding, to go to cash, to hide under the proverbial mattress like his father had always advised. The voice of fear was a deafening roar. Sell. Sell everything. Save what you can. It's all going to zero. He stumbled away from his laptop, his breath coming in short gasps. He paced his minimalist apartment, the clean lines and empty spaces now feeling sterile and mocking. This was what his discipline had gotten him. This gut-wrenching panic. He thought of his classmates from the reunion brochure. Maybe their high salaries and flashy cars were the smarter play. At least they had something to show for their work. He had a spreadsheet tracking a disaster. In his desperation, he did the only thing he could think of. He logged onto the long path. The forum, usually a placid lake of thoughtful posts, was a raging sea of panic. The fear was palpable. Posts with titles like, "I.S. this the Yendi," and "I can't take this anymore," were popping up every minute. He scrolled through them, his own panic reflected and magnified in 1,000 different voices. It was a cacophony of terror. But then he saw it. A post from Riverstone, the retired grandfather. The title was simple, "A Letter to My Younger Self." Evan clicked on it, his hand still shaking. "Dear younger me," it began. "You are terrified right now. I know because I was there in 2008. I was there in 2000. I was there in 1987. The air smells the same every time, like fear and burnt money. Your stomach is in knots. You're thinking about selling. Don't. Listen to me, you stubborn fool. Do not. This is not the end of the world. It is the end of an illusion. The illusion that the path is always smooth and upward. The market is a forest, and forests need fires to clear out the deadwood so new, stronger growth can emerge. This fire feels like it will consume everything, but it won't. It never has. You have an anchor. Do you remember what it is? It's not your portfolio balance. That's just a number on a screen, bobbing on these wild waves. Your anchor is your plan. Your anchor is your automatic transfer. Your anchor is your time horizon, which you measure in decades, not weeks. Your job right now is not to be a hero. Your job is to be a rock. Be boring. Be stubborn. Be still. Do not check your portfolio. Go for a walk. Call a friend. Read a novel. Do anything except make a permanent decision based on a temporary panic. I am writing this from the other side. The sun came up. It always does. The trees grew back, taller and stronger. And the people who were rocks, who held on to their anchors, were the ones who benefited from the new growth. The impatient ones, who jumped ship, were left watching from the shore as the fleet sailed away without them. This is the test. This is the whole game. It's not about intelligence. It's about temperament. So prove you have it. Be the rock. Stay the course. Evan read the post once, then again, and a third time. Tears welled in his eyes, not of fear, but of release. It was as if a wise, gentle hand had reached through the screen and settled on his shoulder. Riverstone wasn't just giving advice. He was giving permission to feel the fear without being ruled by it. He then saw a new post from Patient Oak. It was a single sentence. Just cancel automatic transfer request. We ride the storm out together. Below it, a cascade of comments from other members. Me too. Staying the course. Anchor held. He was not alone in his panic, but he was also not alone in his fight against it. This was the insight, the moment the conflict found its resolution. The storm was external, real, and terrifying, but his anchor was internal, and it was stronger. His anchor was his plan. His anchor was his community. His anchor was the wisdom of those who had sailed these waters before. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first full breath he'd taken in an hour. He stood up, walked away from his computer, and did not refresh his brokerage app. He left his automatic transfer intact. He had passed the point of decision. The panic was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was no longer in control. He had ceded control to his plan. The storm raged for months. The headlines grew more apocalyptic. His portfolio value continued to dwindle. It was agonizing, but he did not look. He followed Riverstone's advice. He took long walks by the harbor, even in the rain. The choppy, gray water mirrored the markets, and he found a strange solace in its relentless, indifferent churning. He read novels. He met Ben for coffee, and they deliberately talked about everything except finance. He lived his life. And then, with a slowness that was almost imperceptible, the dawn began to break. The collapses stopped. The river of red on the news tickers was interrupted by flecks of green. There was no single day when it was over, but a gradual turning of the tide. A year after the worst of it, Evan finally allowed himself to look at his long-term chart. The line was a dramatic, heart-stopping V-shape, a sheer cliff face down, followed by a slow, then accelerating, climb back up. He had lived through the V. His portfolio had not only recovered, but because he had continued his automatic investments throughout the collapse, he had bought shares at fire sale prices. He was now ahead of where he would have been if the crash had never happened. The feeling that washed over him was not joy or triumph. It was something deeper, more profound. It was granted solid confidence. He had faced the absolute worst-case scenario of his investing life, the scenario that kept new investors awake at night, and he had not only survived, he had thrived. The storm had not destroyed his cathedral. It had stress-tested its foundations and found them unshakable. He had proven to himself, in the most visceral way possible, that he had the temperament. He was an investor, not just in bull markets, but in bear markets. Not just in theory, but in practice. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line on a fresh page, underlining it twice. The anchor holds. He knew now, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that no matter what the markets did, he would be okay. He had faced the storm, and he had found his anchor. And that was a knowledge more valuable than any portfolio balance.